We live in an age that demands absolute transparency, yet the single most honest signal a human can give is the physical act of disappearing into themselves. Forget eye contact. Forget micro expressions. The truest language of desperation is the arm block. We've been fed a thin, socially palatable lie about this posture, that crossed arms signify rudeness, boredom, or obstinance. This is the trivial interpretation, the pop psychology sugarcoating meant to keep us comfortable. The brutal, necessary truth is that when a person folds their arms, they are not closing you out. They are locking themselves in, attempting a desperate, silent form of psychological containment when their internal world is threatening to rupture. This defensive gesture is not a choice made at the level of conscious social etiquette. It is an involuntary reflex of the self, a primal reaction to perceived psychological assault. When the mind encounters data it cannot immediately process, internal conflict it cannot resolve, or vulnerability it cannot tolerate, the body intervenes. The arm block is the physical manifestation of psychological defeat, a momentary surrender to the need for rigid structure. It is the body saying, I cannot withstand the pressure of this moment, so I will build a bone and flesh cage around my heart. The most fascinating paradox of defensive body language is that the moment we attempt to look strong and impenetrable is precisely the moment we are at our most fragile. If you're tired of the superficial summaries and shallow answers, if you want to understand the raw, uncut machinery of human behavior that dictates every negotiation, every confrontation, and every romantic failure, then you need to subscribe right now. Don't miss the essential mechanisms hiding in plain sight. The arm block, viewed through the lens of dark philosophy, reveals the inherent fragility of the ego. The center mass of the body, the lungs, the stomach, the heart, is the zone of maximum vulnerability. In evolutionary terms, shielding this area is an imperative for survival. While we no longer fear the spear, the modern human still reacts to existential threats with the same ancient circuitry. A harsh critique from a superior, a sudden, unexpected change in a relationship dynamic, or the realization of one's own failure are all registered by the brain as life-threatening impacts. The arms move across the chest to provide two crucial functions: armor and weight. The armor is obvious, it's a shield, however thin, against the perceived strike. But the weight is far more profound. By pressing the arms firmly against the torso, we are engaging in a form of deep pressure stimulation, a technique known to soothe the nervous system and disrupt panic responses. The individual performing the arm block is actively trying to self-regulate, grounding themselves physically when they are spinning out emotionally. It's an attempt to manufacture stillness in a moment of existential tremor. We fail to understand this because we are obsessed with superficial intent. We see the posture and label it antagonistic, assuming the person is signaling rejection of us. This is where the misunderstanding creates social friction. The person blocking their arms is rarely thinking about the external observer. They are entirely consumed by the internal storm. They aren't saying, I disagree with you. They are saying, much more truthfully, I am currently struggling to hold myself together. This explains why we often see this posture in contexts that seem entirely non-confrontational. A student listening to a difficult lecture, a patient waiting for test results, or someone simply observing a tense political debate. The threat is not the direct confrontation. The threat is the overwhelming complexity or the anticipation of pain. The degree of the block is a diagnostic key we consistently ignore. An arm block is not a monolith. When the arms are held loosely, the hands resting lightly on the forearms, it may truly be mere comfort or coldness. But when the hands migrate to grasp the biceps or worse the shoulders, squeezing the muscle fiber tightly and pulling the shoulder blades forward, we are witnessing a full psychological lockdown. This extreme self-hugging position, what we might call the mantle of stress, activates the fight or flight response while simultaneously freezing the subject in place. They are rigid, braced for impact, yet incapable of moving. In this state, the mind has essentially prioritized self-preservation above all social performance, and any attempt to break that lock by demanding they open up or relax will be perceived as a secondary attack, driving them further into their shell. The arm block is therefore a profound warning. You are approaching the limit of this person's psychological capacity. To ignore that signal is not only rude, it is deeply reckless, guaranteeing the collapse of effective communication. The crossed arms demand not a social rebuke, but immediate analytical observation. What element of this environment is causing this fundamental physical retreat? The suffering that generates the mantle of stress is rooted in a fundamental psychological mechanism: the failure of containment. We walk around, mostly unaware, operating under the assumption that our thoughts and emotions are robustly compartmentalized. But when the cognitive load, the sheer volume of incoming data, conflicting expectations, or unresolved internal conflicts exceeds the processing capacity of the prefrontal cortex, the entire system begins to hemorrhage. The body, being more ancient and brutally honest than the neocortex, attempts a forced reboot. The pressure applied by the hands grasping the shoulders or biceps is a desperate evolutionary attempt to provide deep pressure input, the same biological need satisfied by swaddling an infant or using a weighted blanket. It is the body saying, anchor yourself, hold your edges, do not dissolve. The proprioceptive feedback from the tight squeeze acts as a psychological ballast, a physical anchor thrown into the storm to stabilize a dissolving sense of self. If these deep, uncomfortable truths about human behavior intrigue you, and if you believe that understanding the unseen mechanics of the mind is necessary for a mature life, then you need to subscribe right now, because we will not stop digging until we hit bedrock. But the arm block is not always a response to a current external stimulus. Often it is a fossilized reaction to past psychic violence. For those who grew up in environments where emotional safety was conditional or non-existent, the body learned early that external comfort was a lie, and self-soothing was the only reliable mechanism. This posture, therefore, often bypasses the cognitive layer entirely, springing from the body's deep memory, a memory far more accurate and less prone to rationalization than the conscious mind. The individual isn't consciously deciding to look unapproachable. Their sympathetic nervous system is running an old, essential script. The world is unsafe. Provide your own hug. They are acting as their own, deficient internal parent, attempting to offer the physical reassurance they never consistently received. The tension in the biceps is the embodied memory of the stressor itself, replayed in real time whenever perceived vulnerability surfaces. What we are seeing is not merely current discomfort, but the activation of an entire archived history of learned helplessness being actively resisted through physical rigidity. This brings us to the profound ethical danger inherent in observing the arm block. When we see someone physically containing themselves in this manner, our instinct, particularly in a culture obsessed with forced vulnerability and opening up, is to intervene, to try to break the posture, perhaps by leaning in or lightly touching their arm. This is a catastrophic error in social physics. The individual is using the posture to maintain psychological integrity. They are holding the line against psychic collapse. Breaking that line, attempting to force openness when they are signaling deep, desperate closure, is tantamount to ripping the stitches out of a fresh wound. It is an act of aggression, perceived by the nervous system as a direct violation of their last line of defense. The person feels exposed, ridiculed, and utterly betrayed, guaranteeing that they will retreat further next time. We must learn to honor the sacred necessity of temporary psychological retreat. The crossed arms are a sign demanding space and silence, not an invitation for superficial cheerleading. If you find value in these detailed breakdowns of human behavior, analysis that goes beyond the superficial social rulebook to reveal the true mechanics of suffering and self-defense, then please take a moment to subscribe. Your support makes it possible for us to deliver this level of unfiltered psychological depth. The mechanism driving this lockdown is often a specific cognitive collapse known as hyper-accountability syndrome. This is particularly common in high-achieving or highly conscientious individuals who operate under the delusion that they must intellectually manage every variable and every emotional outcome. When the situation becomes too chaotic, too emotionally charged, or too complex to control, The internal monitoring system panics. The arm block is the physical manifestation of the mind seizing up. It is the ego's final desperate attempt to create an island of control by reducing all sensory input to the immediate pressure of the self-clasp. The true function of the posture is therefore not rejection of the external party, but a hyper-focused reduction of the self to the smallest possible manageable unit. They are trying to locate their own gravity in a world that feels suddenly weightless, and their body is performing the most basic survival check. Am I still here? Can I still feel myself? The rigidity provides the definitive, reassuring answer. Yes, I am contained. I exist. I am not yet erased. This desperate containment strategy explains why the hyper-accountable individual is often perceived as cold, resistant, or even narcissistic in moments of crisis, when in reality they are experiencing an acute neurological shutdown. They are not rejecting your reality. They are attempting to secure their own, failing to realize that this very act of extreme intellectual self-management ensures their deep isolation. The crossed arms become a self-imposed psychological barricade, turning the body into a fortress under siege, a state where the internal resources are entirely consumed by the effort of keeping the walls from collapsing, leaving no energy whatsoever for diplomacy, processing external information, or, crucially, for the necessary vulnerability required for genuine repair. They are locked in a zero-sum game with their own failure, believing that the admission of chaos is a greater threat than the chaos itself. Consider the classic, brutally honest, real-world example: the corporate post-mortem meeting following a catastrophic project failure. The lead engineer or the executive who signed off on the doomed decision sits at the polished conference table, shoulders hiked high, arms welded across their chest. Around them, the rest of the team dissects the data: the budget overruns, the structural flaws, the unforgivable errors in judgment. The room is saturated not just with fluorescent light, but with a palpable toxic mix of fear and righteous blame. To the observer, the executive's posture screams defiance. I am not accepting this. The reality is far more terrifying for the individual in question. Their internal monologue is a screaming vortex, cycling between punishing self-recrimination and a futile attempt to recalculate the past. They are not processing the critique about the API integration. They are desperately trying to physically anchor themselves against the existential terror of losing control over their entire professional identity. Every bullet point presented, every metric flashed onto the screen, is experienced not as information, but as a direct physical violation of their last mental boundary. They cannot open their arms because doing so would symbolize opening the floodgates to the inescapable truth that they are, in fact, fallible, that their meticulous planning was inadequate, and that reality refused to conform to their spreadsheet. This performance of rigidity is the only thing standing between them and a total psychic disintegration at the table. We often mistake this profound internal struggle for arrogance, demanding they open up and be accountable, completely missing that they are already hyper-accountable to the point of collapse. They are performing self-flagellation in real time, and our forced intervention only serves as a distraction from their primary internal task: surviving the psychological bombardment. This leads us to the critical distinction between accountability and performative self-punishment. True accountability involves vulnerability, the willingness to absorb painful feedback and adjust future behavior. Hyper-accountability, the pathology of the arm block, is the desperate attempt to preemptively punish the self so severely that external judgment loses its sting. It is a defense mechanism that seeks to prove to the world, and more importantly to the self, that I already hurt worse than you can possibly make me hurt. It is a deeply isolating strategy because it transforms every potential relationship, personal or professional, into a tribunal. This is why these individuals struggle so deeply with authentic intimacy. They assume that any closeness will eventually lead to the discovery of their foundational flaw, the lack of total control, and therefore the most rational defense is preemptive, rigid distance. The closed posture is a warning label. Do not enter. Perimeter breached. If these deep dives into the hidden mechanics of human emotional defense provide you with a clearer map for navigating the psychological terrain, and you want to ensure that this kind of brutally honest analytical content continues to be available, then please consider supporting this channel by hitting that subscribe button. It is the direct mechanism that allows us to bypass the noise and deliver this level of focused, unapologetic psychological clarity. The arm block, therefore, is not a simple communication failure. It is a profound declaration of war against the uncontrollable future. It is a strategy honed in childhood, perhaps under the weight of excessively high parental expectations or early trauma where openness was swiftly punished. The individual learned that safety was synonymous with self-containment, and that relying on the outside world for emotional validation or safety was an untenable risk. The moment the adult world presents a comparable level of perceived threat, be it emotional betrayal, financial instability, or professional failure, the body reverts instantly to that primal, successful defense system. They are not adults in that moment responding to adult stimuli. They are terrified children locking the bedroom door, hoping that if they are quiet and still enough, the danger will simply pass them by. This involuntary regression explains the near physical impossibility of relaxing the posture. It is a neurological imperative, not a choice. To ask them to drop their arms is to ask them to voluntarily dismantle the only thing they believe is keeping them safe from utter devastation. And the tragic irony, the final twist of the knife, is that this very act of self-preservation guarantees the isolation that they fear the most, perpetuating the cycle where the lack of genuine connection increases the need for rigid self-control. They become brilliant statues, perfectly contained, beautifully rigid, and utterly disconnected from the messy, healing power of shared humanity. But we must aggressively confront the cultural lie that legitimizes this psychic retreat, the great emotional fraud sold to us under the guise of strength. The myth of the perfectly independent, self-contained human being. Society does not just tolerate the arm block, it often lionizes it, celebrating the person who needs no one, the individual who has seemingly mastered all fragility through sheer, armored willpower. We are told that emotional resilience means creating walls so high that nothing can ever penetrate them again. This is not resilience, it is petrification. Genuine strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the capacity to process vulnerability without collapsing, and that processing requires external input. It requires the messy, terrifying reality of connection. The Iron Man complex, the relentless drive toward performative stoicism and absolute self-sufficiency, is merely the sophisticated adult version of the child locking the bedroom door. It is an unsustainable, exhausting performance. Those who achieve this state of perfect independence have, in fact, achieved the perfect prison. They confuse boundaries, which are porous, necessary definitions of personal space that allow for healthy exchange, with walls, which are monolithic structures designed to prevent all exchange, both good and bad. The arm block is the body's architectural testament to the primacy of the wall. It is the ego arguing that the temporary pain of loneliness is preferable to the catastrophic pain of betrayal. Yet the deep, insidious truth is that the wall designed to keep the pain out is also flawlessly efficient at keeping the nourishment in. It starves the soul under the pretense of safeguarding it, mistaking anesthesia for recovery. It is a slow, dignified death by emotional dehydration. The very language we use betrays this confusion, celebrating the person who is thick-skinned or unflappable, subtly encouraging an internal rigor mortis where flexibility and genuine responsiveness are dismissed as weaknesses. If this level of unapologetic analytical dissection of our most fundamental psychological deceptions is the kind of content you find essential for navigating the complex landscape of human behavior, and you recognize the effort required to produce and sustain a platform dedicated solely to confronting these comfortable cultural lies, then please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It is the mechanism that ensures the continuation of this deep dive, bypassing the superficial chatter and guaranteeing the delivery of psychological clarity directly to you. The rigid self-defender lives in a state of anticipatory dread, their primary emotional engine being the desperate avoidance of future shame, future loss, or future exposure. They aren't trying to live. They are trying not to be defeated. They are perpetually fighting the last war, unaware that the conditions have changed and that the defensive fortress they inhabit has become the greatest threat to their survival. The ultimate tragedy of this posture is the loss of critical calibration. When you live behind the wall, your perception of risk becomes distorted. Every minor social interaction, every request for flexibility, every small act of trust registers on the alarm system as an existential threat. They become the person who ruins the entire week over a single critical email, not because the email was genuinely devastating, but because their defense mechanisms possess no volume control. They are trapped in a binary state, either completely safe, behind the locked door, or facing total annihilation. There is no middle ground, no nuanced spectrum of manageable risk. The capacity for emotional regulation is outsourced entirely to the external environment, meaning their internal peace is entirely dependent on the world remaining perfectly still and benign, which is the one condition the universe absolutely refuses to meet. This extreme psychological hardening is not a mechanism born of adult strength. It is a blueprint drafted in childhood, a time when genuine helplessness was a daily reality. The hyper-vigilant adult is simply an 8-year-old operating the controls of a 70-ton tank, interpreting every speed bump as an ambush. They suffer because they fundamentally lack the internal resources to metabolize pain. They were never taught, or were prevented from learning, that distress is a temporary biological state that passes, leaving behind information, not just damage. Instead, the mind concluded that pain equals annihilation, and the only solution is preemptive structural integrity. The inner world of the rigid person is characterized by profound psychological poverty. Because they do not trust their own capacity to mourn a loss, survive a rejection, or adapt to a shift, they must expend astronomical amounts of energy ensuring the loss, rejection, or shift never occurs. This is the tragic trade. They exchange the possibility of happiness for the certainty of stagnation, mistaking the absence of movement for the presence of safety. They become the ultimate expression of the anti-fragile, the person who gains nothing from chaos and shatters under the smallest pressure because they have insulated themselves completely from the necessary micro-traumas of daily life that actually build resilience. They have refused to pay the small, manageable taxes of existence, the daily frustrations, the minor insults, the necessary disappointments, and so the IRS of reality shows up eventually demanding everything all at once. The cost of this emotional hoarding is the complete excision of spontaneity. A spontaneous act, an open-ended conversation, a decision made without 3 days of risk assessment, represents an intolerable threat to the carefully curated internal architecture. They are terrified of what they might find in the uncharted territory of their own reactions, because the rigid self-defender believes their true self is inherently volatile and destructive. Thus, the external defenses, the strict rules, the predictable schedule, the boundary violations masked as principles, are actually a desperate attempt to manage the supposed monster locked inside. They don't trust their emotions, so they build a dam against them, unaware that a dam built against the natural flow of life will eventually back up and flood the very structure it was meant to protect. They are convinced that if they simply keep the world quiet enough, they can maintain control. But the universe is loud, chaotic, and fundamentally indifferent to their need for predictability. This constant need for external control over internal experience is the definition of suffering, transforming every unpredictable moment into a personal failure, forcing them to live in a perpetual state of exhausting vigilance. The ultimate paradox of the rigid stance is that by attempting to eliminate all vulnerability, they become optimally vulnerable to the inevitable reality of change. They confuse hardness with strength, assuming that the iron rod is superior to the flexible reed, forgetting that when the inevitable storm comes, the iron rod snaps clean, while the reed merely bends and returns. Their refusal to yield ensures their catastrophic break. They have guaranteed the very outcome they dedicated their entire operational existence to avoiding, trapped by a flawless yet fatally flawed system of self-preservation. The tragic consequence of this absolute refusal is not the suffering of failure, but the cold, sterile agony of irrelevance. The person who builds their life on the principle of immutability becomes a historical artifact, while the present surges onward, leaving them perfectly defended against a world that no longer exists. They die in a fortress they spent a lifetime constructing, forgetting that the point of a fortress is to protect the people inside, not simply to stand against the wind. When their perfect system finally fails, when the unpredictable disaster inevitably arrives, it isn't a sudden, violent break, but a quiet, structural decay, invisible until the whole edifice collapses into dust. They realize too late that the emotional currency they valued above all else, perfect control, was utterly worthless because control is an illusion upheld only during times of peace, dissolving instantly when reality demands true strength. The verdict, then, is this: there is no system of self-preservation capable of surviving reality, because reality's only constant is change, and the only true strength lies in the capacity to yield to the inevitable. The rigid stance is not protection. It is a declaration of war against the nature of existence itself, a war that is lost before the first shot is fired. You cannot win against the universe by demanding that it behave. The only winning move is to stop playing that game entirely. True resilience is not measured by how well you prevent the storm, but by how quickly you can rebuild, or even better, by how skillfully you learn to sail using the violent winds you cannot tame. It means abandoning the monstrous task of policing your internal reactions and learning instead to tolerate discomfort, recognizing that vulnerability is not a weakness to be purged, but the prerequisite for genuine connection and growth. The path to freedom is terrifyingly simple. Stop insisting that you are safer in the prison of your own making than you are outside, exposed to the light. The irony is that the moment the rigid person allows for the possibility of breaking, they finally become unbreakable. They find peace not in the absence of conflict, but in the acceptance of their own fragility. This is the ultimate confrontation every thinker must face. Are you willing to embrace the terrible beauty of your own potential destruction, or will you choose the slow, suffocating death of perfect defense? Most people choose the latter, preferring the comfortable lie of certainty to the agonizing truth of freedom, mistaking the absence of pain for the presence of happiness. They will tell you that this kind of intellectual excavation, this relentless pursuit of the painful mechanisms of the self, is cynical or morbid. They are wrong. It is the purest form of optimism, because it proceeds from the assumption that the truth, however sharp, is ultimately better for the soul than any comforting delusion. We dissect the darkness not to revel in it, but to find the light switch. If you believe, as I do, that the unexamined life is a moral and practical tragedy, and if you demand content that refuses to flatter your existing preconceptions, then this is your community. Subscribe now and join the small, defiant cohort of people who are willing to look directly into the systems that fail us, including the one built inside our own minds. The final verdict, then, is this: the effort to eliminate risk is the highest risk of all, because it guarantees the sterilization of your existence. Control is the most seductive narcotic known to the human mind, but it is ultimately the prison warden of potential. You cannot negotiate with reality. You can only meet it, recognizing that every attempt to smooth the jagged edges of life is an act of self-mutilation, removing the very features that could have given you definition. The ultimate psychological freedom is achieved not when you have mastered reality, which is impossible, but when you have finally surrendered the monstrous delusion that mastery was ever required. Stop trying to pave the wilderness of your soul. Stop demanding a soft landing. The only thing worse than confronting a monster is realizing that the monster you fear is simply the unedited raw potential of your own life, waiting for you to stop running. We spend our entire lives terrified of chaos, only to discover on our deathbeds that chaos was the only place where true meaning could be forged. If these ideas resonate, if you feel that sharp, electric truth demanding more from your attention span than fleeting distraction, then you belong here. If you are ready to dismantle the self-imposed defenses and rebuild on the bedrock of unflinching clarity, then subscribe now. Join the community of those who understand that the greatest battle is always the one fought internally, and who refuse to lose. The final verdict on this human experiment is simple. You have been given the terrible freedom to choose between the anesthetic of comfort and the acute pain of consequence. The guarantee of safety is not a reward. It is the swift delivery service to mediocrity and eventual oblivion. True sanity, therefore, is not found in the mastery of your circumstances, but in the radical acceptance of your own inherent fragility and powerlessness over the truly important variables. Stop building walls against the storm. Learn to sail through it, recognizing that the only thing worse than the chaos outside is the perfect, sterile order you impose upon your internal world. The highest act of courage is to face your life without the psychological armor of expectation, to choose the burning clarity of truth over the cool darkness of the lie. This journey demands commitment, vigilance, and a refusal to settle for platitudes. If you are one of the rare few who see the value in this brutal self-honesty, if you demand the map of reality, even when it shows mountains you must climb, then I ask you one last time, subscribe now. Join the only community dedicated to fighting the psychological war against self-deception, and never let yourself win the battle for comfort at the cost of your soul. The verdict on the human condition is not a plea for redemption, but a demand for acceptance. Your life will be defined by the quality of the suffering you choose to endure. Stop hoping for an easy road. The greatest sin is not failure, but the deliberate, psychological minimization of your own potential under the guise of responsibility. I believe the only path forward is the one paved with the difficult, essential truth you are currently avoiding. Do not let the quiet darkness of inertia swallow the blazing potential of your single, terrifying life. That is the fight. That is the purpose. Subscribe now and join the only community dedicated to fighting the psychological war against self-deception, and never let yourself win the battle for comfort at the cost of your soul. We begin the work today.